So we're entering the period before Pesach, Passover holidays, and it's springtime here in Northern California. All the blossoms are out. It's so beautiful. And we all have clients and people in our lives who are experiencing end of life and who are approaching end of life and trying to come to terms with that even in the midst of spring and renewal. So it's a tender time for those who we're working with and those we know who are really grappling right now. And I myself have a particular set of clients. It's a couple, an elderly couple. And I started working with them a few months ago. And the husband is 92 and the wife is 87. And they had recently moved to senior living facility, but still independent living. But they were both kind of teetering on the edge, which is why their adult children had them finally persuaded them to move, right? And I met with them and we played the Go Wish card game. And it's deck of cards where a collection of really important values and wishes have been gathered for us to see where do we fall in this set of values, what's most important to us individually and personally. And for this particular couple, both the husband and the wife said in their top three cards that to have their funeral arrangements made would bring them great comfort. They wanted to have all of their funeral arrangements made in advance. And I said, okay, let's talk about this. Let's get to work and see what we need to do. And they said, well, we probably have this already tied up because and settled because we have already purchased a plot recently in the last few years. We chose a cemetery and we chose a double plot. And so that's it, right? And I said, no, that's not it. There's so much more. It's not just the cemetery plot. And they were really surprised to hear this. They said, doesn't the cemetery take care of everything? And so that's when we went down a path of learning about the difference between the cemetery and a mortuary and a funeral home, and what does a funeral director do? And we started to unpack all of this, and it wound up in us coordinating a Zoom call with this couple and myself present in their home on Zoom with a representative from our local Jewish funeral home, Sinai Memorial Chapel. And she was explaining to this couple everything that they would need to pay for and have on board. And they were quite surprised that there would be an additional $9,000 per person cost for everything, including the casket, the transportation from the place where they would die to the funeral home, and then from the funeral home to the cemetery, plus storage and refrigeration of the body in between. And then, of course, having the option of a shomer, which would be somebody to symbolically guard the body until burial, and then the tahara and the shrouds, excavation of the plot and opening the grave and closing the grave, and then the liner of the grave. And this again is for a traditional Jewish burial in a traditional cemetery. Obviously not a green cemetery if you're going to be paying for a cement liner and the requirement of some type of casket. But anyway, it was a really eye-opening experience for them and for me, to be honest, because I knew that we had this wonderful Jewish funeral home, but I didn't know all the nuances and all the differences between the mortuary and a funeral home and the cemetery and all those interrelationships and the cost. Interestingly, one of the things that the funeral home representative said to this couple, was that, as soon as the person dies, you get on the phone, you call the funeral home, and we'll be there within 2 to 3 hours. And I said, well, actually, I think it's okay to wait longer if they want to. They don't have to call immediately, and you don't have to come immediately. And even the representative from the funeral home balked at that and said, what do you mean? We always come within 3 hours. And I said, there's no law that says that that has to be so. It's okay for the body to stay longer, even if they're Jewish, and even if we've called you, that's really something that the family should decide. So I was glad I was there to help with that moment of choice and clarification. I want to also talk for a few more minutes and give a couple of different case studies that I've encountered, that are very different. So one of them was a couple I worked with that was not Jewish, and they were younger than this elderly couple I just described. They were in their 50s, and the wife was dying of cancer. And she kept saying to me every time I met with her, do we, I'm not ready to talk about the funeral arrangements and what's going to happen to my body. Can we wait till next time? And I would say yes, although I really strongly think we should talk about it now before you have a crisis or before you can no longer communicate or something happens. We don't want to do this at the last minute and stress out your husband and your family. And she would say, I understand, I get it, but I'm just not ready. Can we do it next time? And then it was the last minute, and she was very close to death. And I pulled her husband aside. I said, she wasn't able to do this, and I understand why. It was too difficult for her to think about it and make a plan, because then it was so real and concrete. But now it's up to us. We need to do this. We need to do this because when she dies, which will be within a few days, we want to know who to call, and we want them to be expecting our call and know who you are and who she is and have all the details for the death certificate in advance, so that you're not having to be on the phone for a long time after her death with the funeral home and figuring all of this out. And, it was unfortunate because he was under pressure at that time. And that particular funeral home that he chose, because their family had used them before, was not easy to work with and promised them ease and comfort by selling them a very expensive package, which included an officiant. And when I showed up for the funeral, I was invited to come to her funeral a couple weeks later. Um, there was no officiant at the funeral, believe it or not. And this was in a beautiful chapel and a beautiful cemetery, and nobody came to officiate. And I went to the front desk and I said, what's going on? I know they purchased a package that included an officiant. And they said, oh, that person's in a meeting right now with another client. Sorry. And so the family was left to facilitate their loved one's funeral. And it was really painful to watch and experience because they were not equipped to do that. My third case study is a family who identified as Jewish, but didn't have any Jewish practice or community. And yet it was an important part of their identity. So when their father died, they said, we know that he would have wanted a rabbi. And I said, great, here's a list of rabbis. They said, no, 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 a rabbi, a male rabbi. I said, well, there's female rabbis too, and these ones are really great. And they said, well, we know that our dad would have wanted like an old male white rabbi, and that's what we want for him. I said, okay, I know just the person. My husband would be glad to do it, and I can help. So my husband and I co-officiated that funeral, and I got to be there. After the funeral, they said, we'd like to invite everybody to come from the chapel and walk through this columbarium to the place where our brother's ashes are interred, and that's where our father's ashes will also be interred. And that was my first time in a place called Chapel of the Chimes that some of you probably know in Oakland. It's an amazing historic columbarium that looks like it's right out of Hogwarts and Harry Potter. It's unbelievable. And we went all the way to the back, and there in the back, there was a beautiful bench with a glass case beneath it. And that's where they had set up almost like a diorama of objects that were meaningful to this young man who had died. And his father would now be buried beside him in terms of his ashes. And they had in there a bunch of Jewish objects. So that was a real lesson for me, like, wow, there really are so many ways to die Jewishly and body disposition, and I should never make assumptions and I should never make judgments. And then finally, just one final case study, a client that I'm working with right now who is very clear that she also wants to be cremated and her ashes interred next to her deceased husband's ashes in a Jewish section of a cemetery. She said, you know, it's about time now as I'm approaching my death, because she's anticipating her death due to a medical condition, that we finally put a plaque on my husband's urn and invite my whole family to come. And she said, and I see that as a rehearsal for what they're about to do for me as well. I want to be there and I want to have a little ritual, have a little ceremony. But when they come to do this for my late husband, then they'll know exactly what to do for me. And it gave her a lot of comfort. And I thought that was really beautiful. There's things that I feel like every doula should consider or ask themselves. Does your client have a relationship with a funeral home already? What were their experiences with that funeral home? Were they positive? Do they want to work with them again? Or were they not so good? And do you want to help them find a new place? Do you have a local Jewish funeral home or not? We're lucky here in the Bay Area to have one, but I know that not everywhere has a Jewish funeral home. So if you don't, then what? And if you do, would you like to work with them? And do you already have a relationship with them as a doula? I really suggest getting involved, if you do, with any local funeral home, whether it's Jewish or not, but establish a relationship, get to know the people who work there, attend some events with them or invite them to some events, because it's going to be helpful to have that relationship. Do you or your client have an existing relationship with clergy and officiants? Do you have sort of a go-to list of officiants or clergy members that you think would be wonderful to facilitate a graveside funeral, a home funeral, a memorial, a Shiva gathering? It's just really good to know who to call or who to recommend. And do you yourself feel comfortable doing any of those things? If your client doesn't have a clergy member or a spiritual community and they don't have somebody to officiate at a memorial or a funeral or a Shiva, do you think you could do it? Have you done that? What was it like? What kind of training did you get in order to feel comfortable? And how did it go? I personally have found it really rewarding and satisfying to be involved in officiating, especially because I knew the person who died and I know their family. I feel like that's special and different than having a random or generic or anonymous clergy person come up, or a chaplain who never knew this family at all and never met the person who died. And there will be a resource sheet. And I wanted to remind everyone that each state in the United States has very different rules and laws regarding body transportation, body disposition, burials, how long the body can be in the home, all kinds of different laws that you may not be aware of. And so there is a link to a state by state review of all the different laws surrounding body disposition and death certificates, etc. And I'd like to end with a quote. Many of you already know that we have pride in the Jewish tradition of simplicity around death care and what happens with the body after death. And there's a reason for that. So I'm going to read to you this quote. We find in the Talmud that there was a time when those who were wealthier would use more expensive materials, and the poor would use cheaper materials. The poor were embarrassed. So the rabbis instituted that the rich use the same materials as the poor. In the words of the Talmud, additionally, at first, the wealthy would take the deceased out for burial on a dargash, a type of ornamental bed, and the poor would take the deceased out on a plain bier made from poles that were strapped together, and the poor were embarrassed. The sages instituted that everyone should be taken out for burial on a plain bier due to the honor of the poor. And that's from the Moed Katan. The rule of using simple materials for the dead also applies to other aspects of the funeral, such as using simple shrouds. And the quote is by Rabbi Yehuda Sherpin. And I will leave us with that. And thank you for listening and hearing my stories. Now let's hear yours.